Okay, so as I said, this session is called Neuromodulation Battlegrounds. Insurgents seek to capture share from incumbents. And our panelists are Victor, oops, sorry about that, Victor. Victor Peikoff. Victor is the CEO of his own startup called MetaPace. But in addition to being an entrepreneur himself, Victor is in the mold of Warren Grill, one of the few academics and scientific researchers who has an understanding and appreciation of the commercial marketplace. And we've used Victor as a resource in much of our market research, which we really appreciate. He's also authored some great white papers, including one on failures. And we'll be happy to share that with, if you approve, Victor, we'll be happy to share that with the attendees here. It's an excellent piece that he authored not that long ago. So Victor is one of our panelists. We also have Dan Brownstein. Dan is a senior vice president at Saluda Medical. And we've asked Dan to come not just because Saluda Medical is one of those upstarts, but also because Dan, even though he looks like a young guy, he's been around the block. He's been in this industry. He's been in this industry for quite a while, and he has a good understanding of the comings and goings of many of the players, both the personnel and the companies. So we're going to ask for his input as well. And speaking of having been around the block a few times, Jeremy Koff, I think he went through his very long career trajectory in his earlier session. So I don't think he needs a lot of introduction, except for me to say that we've been very fortunate these last few years to have Jeremy on our team, not just for what he adds to Neurotech Reports publications, but also he's helped us get a consulting practice going for many of the companies in the industry. Jeremy's been a consultant himself, but also been a key executive at Bioness, at the Mann Foundation, at several other Advanced Bionics. So he knows the comings and goings of this industry as well. So as I mentioned in my talk this morning, there's several new battlegrounds in addition to the spinal cord stimulation market, which was really the first the first battleground where we now have 4 major competitors and several upstarts. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. But there's others, and sacral nerve stimulation for treatment of OAB is another area, non-invasive stimulation. So we're going to talk about a few of those. Deep brain stimulation, guess what? There's now competition from some new startups, including 2 European companies who have entered the market, at least the European market, in the last year or two. So we're going to ask a little bit about that. But before we do, I'm going to give each of our panelists just an opportunity to make some introductory comments. And then I believe, Dan, you have a couple slides, and I'll put those up. And Victor, you also have a couple slides, and I'll put those up from what you sent. But let's start with Jeremy. Just any introductory comments. We don't want to hear your whole bio again. We've heard it, but just your introductory comments on the state of competition within some of these neuromodulation segments. If you just want to give us a.
Happy to. So I worked.
Turn off the analog. Thank you.
So I've worked within industry in OAB, and OSA and chronic pain. So I know the spaces quite well in numbers of the companies. And certainly there is a trend towards larger implantable devices towards minimally invasive, whether it's Nuspera and Nalu and others, StimWave. I originally worked on the Bion microstimulator, even though it wasn't commercialized, but that was really kind of the first minimally invasive. So certainly a trend towards less invasive, and also towards other targets. Originally, actually, the Bion microstimulator, for those familiar with that, was going after pudendal nerve stimulation for OAB. The stim router, which I worked on, also OAB at the tibial nerve. So you're having these other targets. EBT is going after the saphenous nerve for non-invasive. So that's the other comment would be the increase as we talked about towards non-invasive devices, relatively early stage to see the results from some of those devices. But when it comes to wearables, really two major targets that a lot of companies are looking at: auricular stimulation and various points along the ear, as well as the risk for various indications. Telehealth, as an example, going after central tremor at the wrist. So there's just so much excitement within and beyond those major indications that we're seeing, and a lot of new companies and money chasing those companies. So exciting times to be in the space. So thank you.
Okay, and Dan, do you want to give us, I'll get your slides up in a second. Do you want to give us just a little bit of your background?
Yeah, I've been in this space for 15 years, so I might not look it, but I came in 2007 to...
Hold on a second. Can everyone on Zoom here, Dan? All right, looks like we can. Go ahead, Dan, sorry.
All good, thanks. Yeah, I came into neuromodulation in 2007 out of business school. I'd been in the spinal industry before that and was very interested in disrupting the market. So I actually started in spinal modulation in 2007, really at the very beginning, where we were looking at very specific stimulation of the posterior ganglion with Dr. Krames back in the day. Got to see that from concept all the way through selling that device to selling the system to St. Jude Medical, now Abbott, as DRG therapy. The big unmet needs in the space, though, what I saw at the very end of it was that there was really no understanding of mechanism work. You see what Dr. Grill had presented, but we had not actually put sensing into neuromodulation, and especially in spinal cord stimulation. So I'd met John Parker, who was our founder, our chief scientific officer at Saluda Medical, and he had the concept for being able to stimulate and actually sense evoke compound action potentials off of the spinal cord, which could be then applied to a whole platform of technologies going forward. So as I was leaving Abbott or St. Jude at the time, I spent, I think, 3 days there. I went down to Sydney and started working with them. And it's still very early on, technology. So the world was completely different back in the day of 2007, where you had the three big players. Obviously, Advanced Bionics made the big splash with rechargeable therapies. We with DRG therapy, we definitely made a change to being able to actually stimulate peripheral nerve targets, through the spinal cord. And now we're sitting here, in 2022, and have we've just launched the therapy in Europe, and been able to get some good adoption of the therapy here, and are about to launch in the US.
Okay. Dan, I have your slides on screen. Do you want me to advance, or you want
I can walk through this. I think the question that we had was back in 2015, when you looked at really Nevro and spinal modulation entering the market, it was a very quiet industry. You had it was pretty much ripe for disruption. There hadn't been any clinical studies. There hadn't been any really any innovation besides rechargeable therapy at that point. And Nevro coming into the market, had this opportunity with the first level 1 evidence after the therapy had been around since 1967. So from not only neuromodulation, but when you start to look at the SCS market, you also have to look at the other types of interventional therapies. And at that point, there really wasn't much else besides Vertiflex, which was acquired for about $450 million a few years later. So if you go to the next slide, you look at the market. The market has continued to grow at like high single digits. With COVID, it's actually hard to figure out exactly what the split of the big players are. They're pretty much split evenly between Abbott and Medtronic and Boston Scientific, with Nevro taking about 60% share right now. They've been pretty.
Just curious, Dan, where are you getting some of this excellent market research?
Yeah, maybe the Neurotech reports. It's combined through all the analyst reports that we read. So I try to hone in on the right numbers here.
Thanks for that plug, Dan. We'll get you an extra drink during the cocktail reception. Free coffee.
Yes. So we're looking at right now the recovery to pre-COVID levels. If you'll start to see the numbers here start to crop back up to the 2019 numbers is what I've seen so far for this year. So now let's take a look at 2022. How do we disrupt this?
Whoops. Did you want to move?
You're on it. So now let's look at the pain market in 2022, and it is a lot more crowded here. We've got the same fragmented market of Medtronic, Nevro, Abbott. We talked about these smaller and smaller devices with Nalu. We also have other therapies. Jeremy mentioned Mainstay, that he does some work with SPR, and then on top of that, there's all these other interventional procedures that physicians interventional pain physicians are being distracted by. So not only do you have a $2.5 billion market, you also have to compete with mind share and then operating room time and everything. So it's a completely different space, and you have to think beyond just you have another neuromodulation system. And I think in the last session we talked about digital health company, and I was going to say that we are a digital health company, and it's true. It has to be beyond just introducing electrical energy into the core. It's about recording, and it's about using that data. So if you go to the next slide, it's just how do we, when you look at it, how are we going to disrupt? I'm not going to give away the magic bullet here. So I think Erica Ross in there. I don't want Abbott to learn everything. It is clinical data. I think when you look at launching it into space and neuromodulation space in 22, you still need level 1 evidence. I think you need beyond level 1 evidence. You need real world data. If you can get that prior to a full launch in the US using European and Australian data, because you can get approvals faster. It's about using objective measures. So we talk about at Saluda, we actually stimulate and measure and record on every single pulse 3.5 million times per day. And so all that data is stored on our system, and we've actually improved our therapy. We're on our 3rd generation therapy just before we launched the device in the US. And you also got to look at how do you solve major clinical needs that are in the space. So not just like here's better pain relief, but how am I helping to improve the physician's practice? You got to look at that really carefully, because they're going to choose a Vertiflex system over your SCS system, depending on what the costs are or how does it interrupt their practice. So I think the last piece, I won't go into too much detail, is when you look at also just this huge unmet need. You hate putting this up there, but if you look at the survivability of therapies, this is a publication from OHSU. I can provide reference if people are interested. You look at DBS over a 10-year period versus vagal nerve and the patients that are lost and explanted, and you look at open loop spinal cord stimulation. I'll use that word as really therapies that are just delivering energy and you're not measuring. And I mean, you're down at the 35% level after 10 years, and that's just not. That's something that can really destroy therapy. And so that's something that we're really focused on. I think that's one of the big unmet needs. I'm not sure if physicians translate that into their own practice. I don't have that problem in their own practice, but they're beginning to see that. And so that's where the next slide is just where we come in at Saluda. We have our own cap control spinal cord stimulation, which is closed loop. We're measuring in every pulse. We're actually using that data to help improve the therapy and also improve the patient outcomes. And so we have no loss of efficacy. Patients are set it and forget it. And we think that that's going to help disrupt the industry. We're seeing excitement.
Okay, thanks, Dan. All right, Victor, I'm going to pull up your slides, and while I do that, why don't you give us a little background on yourself?
Since 2015, I left academia and immersed myself in the corporate world. So in the last 6 years, I've been trying to track the successes and failures of newcomers and established companies in neuromod space. And my curiosity has been, of course, on early stages on the valley of death. But right now, I think for the sake of this discussion, we will focus more on companies that made it to the FDA approval. And now, since the topic here is battlegrounds, is essentially once you made it and you're in a crowded space like spinal cord stimulation or sleep apnea or some other spaces, what makes some companies successful, some are not so successful. So if you can go to slide number 2 first.
Yeah, if I got to deal with Adobe, they're bless their heart. They they want to make sure I'm a paying customer before we show your PDF.
Oh, wow.
All
Okay.
right, I think I've convinced them. Let's see.
Okay.
All right, there you go.
Mm,
No, is that the wrong one?
yeah, that's the wrong one.
It's not you.
No.
Who is that?
Yeah, you're sharing a power. Not. Oh yeah, over there it's correct.
Oh, what? How does that happen? I'm sharing screen one. Screen one has your PDF up there. Someone else is sharing. Who else is sharing?
Maybe start sharing again.
Okay, that's what I'll do. Give me a second.
So what you will see in a second on a slide 2 is this idea of that we can kind of create 3 main buckets for companies that made it through PMA approval. One is so-called first movers, which are the big 3 typically in most spaces. Then we have the followers, sometimes they're called fast followers, and which have some distinguishing features for their therapies, but for the most part, very similar. And then what I call tech-driven companies, which I would put Saluda into that bucket, which are, in addition to being followers, also represent some disruption and fundamentally change how the therapy operates. And since we don't really have financial data on tech-driven companies, for the sake of this presentation, I just focused more on first movers versus followers. And we have financial data from spinal cord field, where it's been quite crowded for a few years. In 2015, as we know, Nevro was approved, Nevro's device was approved, and Nispera device was approved as well. So both of these followers, as I call them, started to challenge the top 3. Can you go to second slide, please?
Yes. Is everyone now seeing Victor's slides? I apologize. My screw up there. I'd get good help around here, you know?
Right. So as you can see on the top left, basically we have first comers, which is the top big 3 companies. Then we have followers, being Nevro and Nispera, which disappeared soon after that. But if you look then on the top right, you will see financial data from the last 7 years or so, and you can see how quickly follower can take on the first movers. And in case of spinal cord stimulation, you can see that that Nevro was able to capture about 15 pretty quickly, and then stayed there. Really didn't make any more headway, which is quite surprising because, I mean, if you start projecting things like that, you would expect them to keep growing. So there must be some other forces at play. And some people call it's like a beginner's success. It's basically when you offer something new, the physicians are interested in maybe trusting. But once the real world data starts flowing in and you don't see much differentiation, you don't see much improvement, much difference, doctors start reevaluating whether Medtronic's and Abbott's and Boston's are good enough, and really Nevro doesn't offer much more than that. And of course, what would be really interesting to see is next year, once we have Saluda approved, hopefully in the US, if that will be a different story from Nevro. So I'm really hoping that that will. So this combination of follower plus tech-driven company that can actually offer a meaningful difference for both surgeons and patients. Nevro, I think, offered something interesting to patients. They could feel their stimulation, but not necessarily to doctors who couldn't really see a lot of difference in outcomes. In this case, I think with Saluda we'll see that it will affect both patient and doctor. I hope that will be the case. And so you will see better outcomes, essentially. So I think that will be an interesting story. And then in the same vein, we can look at the sacral nerve stimulation. So we can see that, of course, we don't have much data, and this was affected by COVID. But we have data from last 2 years from Axonics. And you can see they were able to capture 20% market within essentially 2 years, which is amazing. It's really unheard of. But it's really interesting. Next 2 years will be very interesting. So whether they'll stay at 20 or they will get to 50 or 40. So that, to me, because they do offer some differential technology, but Medtronic is catching up quickly on that. So they, on par, I think the technology is similar. So this is, I think, will be a case of who can provide better, reach out to doctors and provide better experience, I guess. So we'll see.
Okay. So Victor, while we're on that subject, I just want to interject a question here. What's your view of the eventual outcome of this lawsuit between Axonics and Medtronic? And I will mention that for those of you who are subscribers to Neurotech Business Report, we did an update on the legal goings on, but also our kind of 2 cents worth as to why it's in both companies' interest to settle this out of court, because you're really rolling the dice. I mean, it's a crapshoot when you're waiting to see what's the jury going to decide. First of all, is there infringement? And if there is infringement, how much was that worth? Well, we saw in the Boston Scientific versus Nevro case about $20 million. I think Axonics would be happy to write a check to Medtronic for $20 million and be done with it. But what's your view on where you see this going?
Right. Well, the $20 million check, of course, depends on what percentage revenue that represents. So for Nevro, that $20 check, I did calculations, and since 2016 approval of Nevro, that represents roughly 5.5% of the revenue. So which would be similar to what would they paid in royalty, perhaps.
So that's, you think that there was actually some logic into how the jury, this could be the first time ever, there was some logic.
I'm injecting my own logic.
How the jury arrived at that figure.
Right,
okay.
Right.
All right, thank you.
So if Axonics revenue reaches pretty high levels, and this fine will represent some reasonable percentage, below 10%, let's say, to me, that would be a good thing. And then they could actually quite easily settle out of court as well. But if the penalty fine is higher than 10%, I think that can really negatively impact.
Right, but that all assumes that there is infringement.
Right.
And the risk to Medtronic, aside from mounting the legal bills, granted they're a multi-billion-dollar company, they can afford it. But as we saw, when they filed suit against Axonics challenged a lot of patents, and they were successful in getting not full patents, but many of the claims disallowed. So that there's a cost to that to Medtronic. So again, we think it's in everyone's interest to settle this out of court, because you just never know what a jury's going to.
Right, and based on the statistics I pulled up, recent statistics about after a company gets the denial from inter partes review,
right,
about 35% of them pretty quickly settle out of court. So there is a 30% chance at least of.
Right, but remember that Axonics didn't get a full denial; they got a partial. It was kind of like something for everybody.
Right. No, I think it's still ongoing. The challenge is ongoing. I think within the next couple of months they will have a final decision, and at that point, I think the chances will increase for this out-of-court settlement. But regardless of that settlement, I think there is another point here: there is a lot of other. If we can go to the first slide.
I just unshared you.
Sorry.
You want me to share again?
The first slide, sorry.
Which one? Let me pull it up.
Same presentation, first slide.
I know,
So
but
the idea
I
is that
closed
we're not talking about sacral nerve stimulation, and to me, this is going to become a crowded field soon as well. Right now, we only have 2 companies, but if you take into account emerging companies that do tibial nerve stimulation, and we have 5 of them, that's already 7. And that's only if we're talking about overactive bladder. So 7 companies in one field. Yes, exactly. And the mechanism of action here is still somewhat debated. Some feel that the sacral stimulation, the efferents are more important than afferents for overactive bladder. So the jury is still out there. If indeed the efferent is sufficient, then the sacral nerve stimulation probably is the best way to go. If afferent stimulation is important, in that case, tibial becomes important, because afferent, that's the, in tibial stimulation, that's the main mechanism of action, is the afferent.
Right.
And therefore, then all these minimally invasive companies on the top left, there's 5 of them, which are all most of these companies already have 510(k) approval. These are implantable, injectable devices that don't have a battery. So they are approved through 510(k) mechanism. So they already constitute a threat at this point. And so I think in the next few years, we'll see a rather crowded field in the OAB. It all, I think,
you've got some non-invasive vendors
Exactly.
as well doing tibial nerve stimulation, as well as the minimally invasive.
minimally invasive.
All right, what about Nuspera? You have them on there. It's a new technology, very promising company. What's your view of how Nuspera is going to impact the SNS marketplace, if
Right.
at all?
I view them a little bit like I view Saluda for sacral nerve stimulation, spinal cord stimulation field, being a tech-driven company. So they actually add some really novelty to this approach. So, and I think in this case, it's mostly going to be affecting patient because although I don't think it will affect the efficacy, it will affect the safety because the surgery itself will be safer, and overall, because you don't have an IPG implanted, the safety over long term will also be better. So I think this impact on safety might drive adoption and might actually create more customers, and might make it a lot easier for doctor to convince, because overactive bladder is not sometimes such a dramatic disease that patients are willing to undergo full IPG implantation. So I think might create this bridge between tibial nerve and full implant like Axonics. So might actually draw people in, and then later, if they OAB develops further, they can switch to more or just stay with Nuspera.
Okay, interesting. By the way, let me just interject. I mentioned Neurotech reports coverage of the Axonics versus Medtronic. If you haven't seen it and if you're not a subscriber and you want a copy of that piece, just shoot me an email. I'll be happy to send that to you. Before we leave, I'll get you in a second.
Can I just make a comment on that? Or?
On Nuspera?
Yeah, just
Go ahead.
just on the, I mean,
Yeah.
just kind of listening, like not knowing the details of the entire.
Can the Zoom world go down? I just want to make sure. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
You're good.
Close this.
Oh, you're done? Okay, thank you.
No, I was just going to say, like, when you start to look at the parallels between the spinal cord stimulation world, where you have Axonics entering, it's almost exactly as ANS entering, Advanced Bionics entering. And it wasn't driven off of clinical outcomes. It was driven off of battery technology and different technologies. And it seems like almost the exact same place. And so when you read this like beautiful like journal articles, Axonics had, level 1 evidence, right? But when you really dig into it, it's like, well, you still have, patients that have, patients aren't completely dry, right? There's all this opportunity in the field of like improving outcomes. And I look at it, it's exactly what's going on now with spinal cord stimulation, where it used to be the 50-50 club, Dr. Mikhail and Dr. Cream. So we talk about, and now we're getting to the 80% club, right? And eventually we're going to actually know what kind of therapy to give to every patient. I feel like that's going to happen to really disrupt the urinary and fecal incontinence markets.
Okay. Before we move on to pain, and that's a big subject, Jeremy, you're an ex-Bioness person. You're aware that the Bioness stim router, which of course is now Bioventus, one of the applications they're looking at is for tibial nerve stimulation. I'm just curious whether you have any insight or thoughts on what Victor and Dan were just talking about in how that might impact the SNS market.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I was directly involved with the Stimulator and directly involved in that decision to reorient it away from its original
Don't try to make
application
excuses. We know
towards pain and OAV. And, it's certainly a minimally invasive solution. It does require a patch, a percent will have irritation of the patch, but I think, it's not one size fits all. Different doctors want different solutions, and certainly that's an easy solution for lots of doctors where it doesn't.
And let me just interrupt just to make sure everyone understands what we're talking about with the BioNS solution. Just a minute. You just want
Okay.
just 30 seconds on how it works?
Oh, sure. So it's basically a passive lead. So there's no embedded electronics, unlike the StimWave, which has embedded electronics. And so it's injected in the leads, maybe about that long, and then has essentially an external patch that sends a transcutaneous stimulation across the tissue, where a portion of the electrical current is picked up on the proximal end, where there's what's called a pickup electrode. I don't know what the term is that they use. And then it's routed down to the distal end for the target nerve.
Okay,
So
30
very
seconds is up.
simple device, and it seems to work quite well. So the first application that they were actually the first PNS system to get 510K clearance before any of the others. And then, the second indication was, or is, overactive bladder at the tibial nerve. For PNS, you can just put it anywhere below the neck for pain. But, I think I just want to make a comment that is often not talked about in terms of, startup companies in certain areas, whether it's Nuspera or others, and that has to do with what does it take to be successful? And Al Mann used to give lectures about what it takes to be successful, and he would always say the most important thing is capital, number one. Number two is capital. Number three, also capital. Then it's management, and then it's technology. So when we look at Nuspera, they have the capital now. They have I've done some work for Nuspera as well. Great management team and really smart folks, and they have, as you mentioned, a technology lead position in terms of what their offering is, and so they have the right mix to what it takes to be successful. But it isn't always the best product that gets to market, regardless of the sector, right? There's so many factors to get out there. The other point I want to make, and when we look at SES or any of these applications, is the training element is number one, where it's so expensive to train doctors, to fly them around, to put them overnight, to do cadaver work, and the industry hasn't yet moved away from there. I think that's really important for scalability, to just getting people up and running. Number one. Number two is, and this even goes back 25 years when I started with advanced bionics with cochlear implants. If I'm from a surgeon perspective, and Dr. Krames, you can probably comment on this, where every new device that you have, you got to learn a new procedure, you got to have stock, you have to have different reps, different programming, and there's a cost to you to have another device in your tool bag. How many devices do you want? So I was actually shocked when Nevro came to the market as a late comer, when doctors are already doing, two is probably the ideal, to have a third device, and now Nevro being a fourth device for some doctors. Do they need that many devices if there's a surgical procedure? So I think with the minimally invasive, easier procedures, and certainly non-invasive, you can have more product offerings. And Dr. Krames, I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of,
I want to comment about the use of different technologies for a clinician. Is companies invest a huge amount of money in creating, in helping a practitioner get into practice, and also creating a personal relationship with those. So many physicians hesitate to use a new device because they're afraid of getting the company that invested all this money in them, not to support them.
Okay, Elliot, I'm gonna cut you off only because I don't think the Zoom people can hear you. We're gonna get oh, they can hear you? Oh, okay, sorry.
Sorry, you were.
I was just worried that people couldn't hear you, but
Oh, okay.
it seems like they can.
You know, I think that most physicians out there do not use multiple devices. There are some that do. So there's a big hesitancy amongst physicians to do that.
Okay, and Jeremy, the comment you just made leads me into the question I wanted to ask. I want to talk about pain because pain is really the biggest market, has been, will continue to be. Yes, lots of other applications. I want to talk about OSA and talk about DBS in the time remaining, which is not much. We may go a little bit over for lunch, but let's talk about the pain market and SCS. You mentioned, hey, Nevro joining as the fourth player with a new paradigm, right? A new paradigm on how we're going to treat pain. We're going to do high frequency paresthesia free, right? And then all of a sudden Salutin comes along and say, well, wait a minute, we got a better paradigm. It's closed loop stimulation, right? And now Medtronic comes along and they say, well, wait a minute, we've got a better paradigm because we can stimulate glial cells. So we're going to push this DTM, differential targeted multiplex. So we're sending different signals to different cell types. And that's a paradigm shift. And now, of course, you've got Michael Ackerman and his group saying, oh, no, it's ULF. It's all about ULF. So my question really to all three of you is, okay, how do you see these new entrants, the Saludas of the world and the Presidios of the world, and guess what? Some of the people who are doing, like Nuspera, doing tibial, said, hey, or not tibial, but doing SNS, have said, we can do pain as well. And in fact, I think they may have switched the order of their pipeline. But at any rate, you've got those new entrants entering the market. How do you see that impacting the SCS market overall? Is there a fundamental limit on the number of companies that compete, or do you think it's just going to be a free-for-all in terms of M&A, where the Medtronics and the Abbotts and the Boston Scientifics are just going to snap these companies up so they have a competitive leg on the other? How do you see it all shaking down in the next few years? Victor, you start.
Well, I think if we talk about patients' benefits, the outcomes, to me, what Saluda is offering is very clear benefit, because there you're basically tuning the amount of therapy based on how close the lead is. And this is tremendous benefit to both doctors, because it also is safety issue, and also to patients. So to me, that's like on the top of the list. So I can immediately see the benefit. The different stimulation paradigms, to me, time will tell.
Time will tell.
Yeah, and in terms of, if we do a comparison with DBS, we'll see the same thing, that I agree with Warren Grill that the biggest advance there was the closed loop. So I think closing the loop is definitely an enormous advantage, and also from battery conservation as well.
Have to agree with what you and Warren said, which raises a kind of a tangential question: is what, if anything, is preventing other vendors from doing closed loop? Just like NeuroPace was the first one to do closed loop. Do you think other companies are going to say, hey, we can do closed loop too?
Well, I think in DBS it's happening, and Medtronic actually adopted a pretty smart strategy in DBS by offering universities research IPG, where actually physicians can play with it and try to close the loop in different ways for different hospitals like Stanford and Mayo and other universities are playing with it. I'm really surprised that the big three did not expand that to spinal cord, because I think that's another place where they could have done that.
Well, maybe there's some reason, Dan, maybe is there any legal barrier that might be in place that could prevent one of those people from doing what you're doing?
I think in the future, everyone has to have some form of closed loop in order to compete, because it doesn't make sense to be just blindly delivering. Okay, we're beyond that point. Everyone's working on some version of it, whether it's with ECAPs, where, you know, we are very well protected, or whether it's with
So
some.
no one else can do ECAPs. You've got that pretty much, but there are other forms of closed loop. In fact, Medtronic had a closed loop where they were looking at body position and using that to feed back the stimulation.
We would call that a feed-forward system if you're truly.
You call that?
It's not a closed-loop system.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're creating pre-programmed settings to create.
Right.
You know, but it
is
misses
feedback.
the micro movements of being able to deliver the right therapy. I mean, I think the future has to be, you know, within closed loop. I mean, you asked the question about all these other therapies coming into the market, waveforms. There's a lot of marketing, you know, marketing hype. You know, it's trading clinical, you know, clinical utility on preclinical work, then trying to translate that into a patient, and you kind of miss the steps to get to the story, and you forget how you got there. And so you end up getting, I mean, everyone has a different version of DTM. You know, Boston can do DTM, Nevro can do DTM, but they don't talk about it. They don't. So I think that that's going to go away. I think maybe you dealt with it in advanced. I mean, John Parker always talks about the advanced bionics days, where, you know, it was high frequency stimulation at one point before there was evoked potentials, and everyone was working on almost like different waveforms to get there. Eventually, that sort of went away.
Yeah, and I think you know, when you look at industries and how they evolve, where, you know, with the advanced bionics, I mean, I was there from the very beginning, where, you know, there were huge technology differences each time there was a new generation, right? And it was clear in physicians' minds which one was better, you know, for a short amount of time. As it, you know, that industry matured, as, you know, SES, where there is, you mentioned a marketing hype. And you speak to the doctors, and we have a few here, you know, is in terms of, well, which device is better? A lot of them, they'll say, particularly as the industry matures, they're about the same. And, you know, but the companies have to fix on some element for promotion, for hype, to show that they are the best. So every company says they're the best, right? And, you know, it may change a little bit, you know, based on the clinical results, but even those, you know, the companies always pull different results that show their product are the best. So, you know, for the doctors out here, it's like, all right, which is the best SES? You know, can you definitively say which one? I'd be surprised if you could, but maybe you can. Or, you know, maybe you can today, but in a few more years, that gap's going to close more and more.
Okay, we got a question that came in from our Zoom audience, and it's Stefano Giardo. I apologize, Stefano, if I butchered your name. I'll just read your question in the interest of time. What does the panel think about spine fusion companies who are now entering the SCS market with offerings that include implanting an IPG in the same as the same patient undergoes spinal fusion? What do you think about that?
I mean, from a reimbursement, we've been talking about that for years. I remember at Spinal Mod in 2008, it makes a ton of sense to put, you know, a lead in, as because 50% of patients do develop chronic pain after back surgery. And, you know, it's not, you know, Globus Medical has looked at it. Stryker has been, you know, kicking the tires on SCS. So, you know, it makes a ton of sense for.
Do you think that opens the door for bringing in some of these new big medtech players into the neuromodulation space? For instance, Stryker. Stryker has been kicking the tires for many years, but hasn't. So is Globus, absolutely, but hasn't actually entered as a direct competitor. Is that in the cards?
It's been going on for 12 years. I can't imagine. I mean, they need. I think if they're going to come in, they're going to want to buy something or take something like that has a sales force. It's already, you know, created, and then they're going to have to work. You know, the reimbursement piece is a big piece of this, right? So, you know, putting in a lead and a spinal fusion, you lose out on, you know, the lead, the reimbursement, and the battery.
All right. Sorry to cut you off. We're low on time, and before I leave this panel, I want to talk a little bit about OSA. Okay, so in the market for hypoglossal nerve stimulation to treat sleep apnea, the first player was Inspire Sleep. They did very well. One of the great successes, an IPO that brought in billions and dollars, maybe not billions, but hundreds of millions of dollars, and the company's doing really well. Now we have a European company called Nexova. Hey, I got it right. Nixoa, I believe approved in Europe and will soon be approved in the US, probably next year. And then some other players. So Victor, what's your thoughts on the market for the neuromodulation market for treating sleep apnea? How you see that changing in the years ahead? Is there room for more players? And what are the differentiating features that will determine success?
Yeah, in this case, I think it's unlike the previous two examples where technology-driven companies had a better chance, or may have a better chance.
Right.
Here, I think it's biologically oriented companies will have better chance. Let me explain. So, from the first three companies that tried to commercialize it, Apnix,
Right.
Intera, and Inspire, the first two failed, and of those, one actually pursued closed loop. And
Technically, Imthera is still in the market because LivaNova
Sorry.
bought the pieces, and they are approved in Europe. And
right, but Apnix was the closed loop which failed for sure. And so here we can definitely say that closed loop might not, well, at least in those hands, didn't work out. So
by the way, LivaNova bought the pieces of Apnix as well. Now, their product didn't survive, but the IP at least is owned by LivaNova.
But it looks like what I'm trying to say is that Inspire's strategy of open loop worked just fine. So you really don't need closed loop here. It just it's over engineering solution which might not be necessary. But I think on the other hand, what is important in sleep apnea is that it's a complex etiology. So you really don't have a single pool of patients. And you have people with more central apnea, you have mixed apnea, you have an obstructive apnea, and you have obese, non-obese, all these different ranges. And so I think here is the companies have who can enter or will enter in the future will probably target these different populations. And so I think that's what I mean by biological. You have to really do diagnostics and try to tailor your therapy because different nerves and different therapies, especially for mixed and central apnea, will definitely involve more sympathetic nervous system and other things. So
okay. Lunch is waiting. We got a bunch of hungry people, but I want to open up to one last question, either from the audience here or from the Zoom world. Anyone with a question for our panelists on competitive battlegrounds? Laden, is there anyone on Zoom? Don't see any hands raised. Okay, with that, I'd like to say thank you very much to our panelists.